What's up, Internet? This is Corey from Bitfire with another quick devlog video. Today I wanted to go over cleaning up code, writing clean code, and how we can take this function right here, which is not, I don't think is necessarily bad code, but I want to talk about a few of the problems with it and how we can get it something a little bit better. First of all, a couple of the problems here. We have two different return lines, right? So obviously this is an early return to make sure that we don't execute any code if we have a bad access code, right? So just so we know what we're talking about, this process access line function processes an Apache or Nginx access line and turns it into a Bitfire request object that the rest of the code knows how to understand. So we don't want to process access lines that have return codes like 404, 403, 500, any of those kind of errors, we don't want to process them. But things like a 301 redirect or 302 redirect, 200, anything like that, we do want to process. So the first thing we do is we check the access code. If it's above that 399 line, we're going to return null. All right. After that, we got to do some string processing. We're going to explode on a space. Right, so we're going to split up the access URL on a space. This access URL part has get, the query parameter, the query string, and then the protocol like HTTP/1.1. So we're going to split that on space, which pulls that apart, and then we're going to process the access URI inside there, right? That second parameter. These are just aliases for different index numbers. After that, we're going to build the server array, right? So this is like, we're basically taking that access line and we're turning it into the PHP global $server array. So we're adding in the server address, the request method, the query string, HTTP host, right? All that stuff. Then we're going to parse the query string into get parameters, and then we're going to take those two, what PHP would use as super global get and server variables, and call our normal process request, which converts those global variables into a request object, and then we return it, right? It's not bad, but it's not obvious exactly what's going on here. Like if you just sat down and looked at this code, why are we exploding on space? What are we parsing here? What are these indexes? Why are you parsing string on this query? Like, it's not obvious, right? The only thing in here that might be obvious is that this server line is basically mapping this data on the right side to the global, to an emulated global server array. So let's take a quick look at how we can maybe clean this code up. And I want to show you what the finished product looks like, and then we'll go look at the additional functions. So this is the code that we converted that into. And if you haven't watched my video on maybes, or some languages call them optionals, you should really go check that out. I'll try and put a link in the description below. But basically what we're doing here is we're creating a maybe of the process line, right? So we're using get CSV to basically just process the double quotes inside that line, right? It's space separated data, not comma separated data. And anything that has spaces in the data, like say a user agent has spaces, those things are quoted, right? So what we want to do is we want to split the string on spaces, but we want to keep everything that's inside the quotes. That's what stir get CSV does for us, right? So we're going to take that and we're going to put it inside a maybe, okay? Then we're going to make sure that whatever that data is, right? Think of that maybe as just a container that has a couple helper functions on it, right? So here we're only using two different helper functions. If basically says if the data, right? What we're wrapping, this data is basically a little wrapper, an object wrapper around this, what we're passing in here, right? And that's an array of strings, okay? So, you know, I can actually, let's print this out so you can see what we're looking at here, right? Let's print out data, oops. All right, and we'll call our function here. Right, okay, so here's our maybe object, which has, it's just an array that's been exploded out on that access log line, right? Okay, so that's the data. Then we're gonna call if, right? And what this if function does, it says we're gonna call this function on this data, right? The data that's inside our maybe object. And if this returns true, right, something that equates to Boolean true, then we're going to keep the data. Otherwise, we're going to null out the data, right? So if this returns false, these calls right here, this then, these chained thens, which we actually, we could just chain these, right? We could say df, let's see, right? This is, all right, and then we could get rid of this and this and this, right, like this. So then we, so if this HTTP code is not valid, these then calls aren't going to be called, right? This is going to return false. Data, right? Our data object, which in fact, let's take a look at it. Let's do, just so you can see what happens, right? So if we change, where's our function? Have valid HTTP code. If we say, okay, if access line, return access line is less than, let's just say 99, right? Well, our return code here is 200. So by changing that line, right, this is now going to equate to false. So let's see what that does to our data, right? So here's our first print R, right? This is what we get. This call fails because we made that an invalid HTTP code. Now our data is an empty object, right? And if we call if data empty, die empty, right? And if we call that, it's empty, right? And now if we change, let's change that back to from 99, we're going to change it to 399, and we run it again, and it's not empty anymore, right? So what this does is this creates a series of operations that we can run on our data, and we don't have to worry about error handling anymore, right? No more error handling, because the error handling is done for us by the container. So all we have to do is chain the function calls we want to make, and these could be anonymous functions, but for unit testability, I like to make them as actual functions. So then we say, okay, if we have a valid HTTP code, now we're going to split the request URL, which is right here, right? We have an assertion in here, which I should do another video about PHP assertions because they're great to put inside your code all over the place. They really help yourself, you and any other developers you're working with out, identify like programmatic interfaces. This is like almost like developer documentation. It's great for making sure that your environment's set up. I'll do a whole video on it. So basically here we're going to split the initial line into the method and get URL, and we're going to ignore the protocol, right? So we're splitting on that space again, right? That's this line right here, right? So we split the access line based on the spaces. Then we set, now we're going to take those and add two new variables, URL method and URL URI, into this initial data set. So we're going to take this get right here, and this is going to be a new parameter, and we're going to take this URL right here, and that's going to be another URL, another parameter down here. Then we use parse URL to pull out the host if there's any host information and the query string, right? And we add those into this as well. So now if we print R, right? So let's print R so you can see what's happening to this data as we're processing it, right? So let's run that test. So now, yeah, you can see exactly we've taken this line right here and we've added these 4 new parameters, right? Which equates to these guys, right? These 4 lines. So we've added get, we've added this URL, we've added the default localhost because there is no host information in here. And then, oh, you know what? Actually, we do have that information, don't we? This is the, ooh. Yeah, okay. This should be, we don't want to process this guy here. We want to process, okay. I'm going to go back and edit this because we need to pull out this information here. So this is pulling from the wrong data. So we split out the request URI. Then we map the access line to a server array, right? And all that's doing is taking this data and it's turning it into print our data, right? Right, so now if we print this function right here maps this old data set into what looks like a PHP superglobal's server array, right? Which we can then, right? We then call this function as an access line, right? And now we pass that server array to our normal process request, which is going to return a request object, right? So what this has done here is we now have much easier to read code. If someone else is coming into this project, they can say, okay, what is this doing? Well, if we have a valid HTTP code, then we split the request URL, then we map the access line to a server array, and then we do these 2 lines of code. So what we've really mapped this down to is like 1 test, 2 operations, right? And if we want to look at either one of these pieces of code, we can just go jump right to it. And this is the actual meat right here, right? This is what process access line is actually doing. This is what process line is actually doing. It's doing parse string to parse this query string here into and get like a global's get array, right? Like a key value pairs. And then we just process it to this. Now, this function, right? Whatever the return of this function is going to be what this container holds, right? So we're sort of like mutating this data. Now, I think this version of the maybe does use mutable data. The only reason I do that is for performance. If you really want to be pedantic, this should be immutable, which means we should be creating a bunch of new maybes. But because I do this so much in my code, and the code really has to be performant, and I'm looking for sub-millisecond response time for the entire code execution path, this data is mutable. It'd be very simple for you to change the code or use your own implementation to make it immutable. Now, we can't just return a normal data, right? Otherwise, we'd be returning a maybe, which maybe we should do. We would always return a maybe of the request. But the way the interface is currently programmed, it's going to return either null or a request object. So we need to test if the data is empty, right? Which again, if this test fails, this will be empty and will return null. If it's not empty, then we've hit this block of code and we're going to return. Now, notice I'm calling this as a function. If you look at this code right here, let's look at maybe there is this magic method for invoke, right? And this magic method invoke, this guy right here calls this method right here, which we could do, right? That's really shorthand for value, right? We could say that to be a little more explicit. Anyway, that's all I got for you guys today. I'm going to do another video on maybes. I've posted a couple already, but I'm not sure if they're on this channel. If you found this useful or helpful, thumbs up, like down below, really helps me out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys later. Cheers.